Buenos dias und herzlich willkommen bei Gate 7, deinem Podcast über Fernweh und Fotografie. In dieser Show geht es um Menschen, für die Reisen mehr ist als Spaß und Erholung. Freue dich auf praktische Tipps und Tricks, wie du tief in fremde Kulturen eintauchst und lerne, deine Abenteuer in bewegenden Bildern festzuhalten, egal mit welcher Kamera. Bist du bereit? Dann los, lass uns abheben mit deinem Gastgeber, Kai Beermann.
Hallo und herzlich willkommen zu einer weiteren Episode des Gate 7 Podcast. Wenn du diesen Podcast hörst, dann nehme ich mal an, ist Technik in der Fotografie nicht das ganz große Thema für dich, sondern dein Fokus liegt eher auf der Kreativität. Und ja, wenn das so ist, dann ist die Chance auch groß, dass du den Namen meines heutigen Gastes schon einmal gehört hast. Es ist David duChemin. David ist humanitärer Fotograf, arbeitet für NGOs und verschiedene Hilfsprojekte, ist Weltreisender, Workshopleiter, Podcaster und Autor zahlreicher Fotoratgeber. David lässt sich also kaum in eine Schublade pressen. Er ist ein kreativer Freigeist mit der Kamera und vor seiner mittlerweile über 30-jährigen Karriere als Fotograf stand er sogar mal als Komiker auf der Bühne. Davids Bücher begleiten mich schon eine ganze Weile auf meinem Weg in der Fotografie und was ich ganz besonders an ihm schätze, ist, dass er auch jemand ist, für den die Kamera nur ein Werkzeug ist, dass es zu beherrschen gilt. Entscheidend für ein gutes Foto ist die Technik seiner Ansicht nach aber nicht. Für ihn kommt es auf das Auge und das Gespür des Fotografen an. Er sagt: Everyone wants images that are perfectly sharp. We've become so obsessed with it that we are getting images that are more perfect but less poetic. Wie also kommt die Poesie, wie kommt das Gefühl in ein Bild? Das ist die Frage, die wir in diesem Interview unter anderem behandeln, und es ist auch die Frage, die im Zentrum von Davids neuem Buch steht, das Herz der Fotografie, Fragen und Ideen für ausdrucksstärkere Bilder. So der Titel, erschienen ist das Ganze im D-Punkt Verlag. Ja, ein ganz tolles Buch, und wie der Untertitel schon suggeriert, es geht um Fragen und weniger um fertige Antworten, denn nur wer sich die richtigen Fragen stellt, kann auch zu den richtigen Antworten gelangen. Gerade was die Frage angeht, was ist ein gutes Foto, darauf gibt es keine allgemeingültige Antwort. Jeder beantwortet diese Frage unterschiedlich, und genau das ist eben in der Fotografie auch wichtig, dass man selbst die wichtigste Instanz dabei ist, zu bewerten, ist das ein gelungenes Foto oder nicht. Das Schlimmste, was wir als Fotografen machen können, ist, uns von den Meinungen anderer abhängig zu machen oder gar im Internet Meinungen einzuholen. David empfiehlt da: The question is how we can be okay with what we make instead of always asking the Internet, do you like it? Ja, die Frage, was ist ein gutes Foto, wie gesagt, ist unmöglich zu beantworten. Sich auf das Terrain zu wagen, ist wie ein Spaziergang auf Treibsand. Es gibt keinen festen Grund, keine soliden, allgemeingültigen Kriterien. Das sieht auch David so. Er sagt: There's no such thing as a good photograph. What does that even mean? There's no objective standard. Ich denke, das ist sehr treffend auf den Punkt gebracht, denn am Ende geht es ja darum, den Spaß an der eigenen Fotografie zu behalten und sich dabei nicht von den Meinungen anderer treiben zu lassen. Der kreative Prozess ist kein Sprint, der zu einem konkreten Ziel führt, das man sich vorher einmal gesteckt hat, sondern im Gegenteil, es bedarf eines sehr langen Atems. David sagt: Craft is a very long game. Ja, ich hoffe, du hast Lust auf dieses sehr abwechslungsreiche Gespräch über Kreativität und die Frage, wie wir unsere Bilder ausdrucksstärker gestalten können. Denn selbst wenn es nicht möglich ist, die Frage allgemeingültig für alle zu beantworten, was ein gutes Foto ist, so ist es doch möglich, diese Frage für sich selber zu beantworten. Wie du dahin gelangst und mit welchen Werkzeugen, darum geht es in diesem Gespräch. Das Interview mit David habe ich auf Englisch geführt, und ich habe ja auch in der Vergangenheit hier und da schon mal englischsprachige Interviewgäste gehabt. Das bietet den Vorteil, dass ich dadurch die thematische Bandbreite etwas erhöhen kann und auch internationale Gäste einladen kann. Schreib mir gerne mal, wie du das findest und ob du dieses Format gerne öfter hättest. Ja, apropos Englisch, ich habe ja vor einigen Jahren auch mal mit einem englischsprachigen Fotografie-Blog begonnen. The Art of Creative Photography heißt der. Ihn gibt es immer noch. Darauf zu finden sind über 400 Interviews mit internationalen Fotografen aus allen Genres, Porträt, Reportage, Street, alles, was man sich vorstellen kann, ist dort zu finden. Eine große Ressource an Inspiration. Also schau da gerne auch mal vorbei. Den Link findest du in den Shownotes zu dieser Episode auf www.gate7.de, 7 ausgeschrieben, nicht als Zahl. Dort zu finden wie immer auch die Shownotes zu dieser Episode mit ein paar zusätzlichen Informationen über David. So hat David zum Beispiel auch einen wunderbaren Podcast, A Beautiful Anarchy heißt der. Kann ich sehr empfehlen, da mal reinzuhören. Ja, und wenn du heute zum ersten Mal Gate 7 hörst und dir der Podcast gefällt, dann würde ich mich natürlich auch sehr darüber freuen, wenn du ihn abonnieren würdest. Du findest Gate 7 auf allen großen Podcast-Plattformen, Spotify, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Deezer, wo auch immer du am liebsten Podcast hörst. Ich würde mich sehr freuen, wenn du diesen Podcast auch noch abonnierst, in deine Playlist mit aufnimmst und so keine neue Folge mehr verpasst in Zukunft. Aber auch ein Blick zurück lohnt sich. Mittlerweile finden sich über 190 Episoden im Archiv. Da ist also für jeden Geschmack etwas dabei, zu allen Genres der Fotografie und auch viele inspirierende Reisegeschichten. Also schau dich da auch gerne mal um. So, jetzt aber genug der Vorrede. Lass uns eintauchen in das Interview mit David duChemin. Viel Spaß! Hello, David. Welcome on my podcast.
Good morning, Kai. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. David, it's such a pleasure having the chance to talk with you. I really appreciate you taking the time for this conversation. I've followed your beautiful work for quite some time, and I think every photographer interested in the creative side of photography has at some point come across your beautiful books. Your most recent one is called The Heart of the Photograph. It's also just been published here in Germany by duChemin Verlag. The title is Das Herz der Fotografie. That's something I'd like to talk with you about later on in this interview. But to get us started, let's learn a little bit about yourself. Can you still recall your first camera moment? And if so, what was it like? And what was it that eventually got you hooked on photography and led to a lifelong fascination with the medium?
I have a couple of them. One I've never actually talked about publicly. It just occurred to me. The very first, my father was a photographer, and at a certain point, I think I was maybe 10 years old, he gave me for Christmas a very small 110 format camera. And if you know anything about film, the 110 format it was small. It had negatives about the size of your fingernail. And, of course, the image quality was predictably terrible. But you could put it in your pocket, and it had two lenses. It had like a wide setting and a tele setting. And there was nothing you could screw up. You just advanced the film, you press the button, and they frankly, they were all terrible. But there was something about it. I mean, I walked around with this thing, and it would fit in your pocket. And I spent all my spending money on these very, very terrible photographs. But there was just something about it that it was magic to me. And then several years later, I found a camera that my mother owned I was snooping around and I found this camera, and it was a Yashica 35 millimeter. And I had no idea what I was doing with it, but I started playing with it. And it was only then that I realized it had film in it. And I thought, oh my God, my mother's going to find out that I've been, doing this. And so at some point I figured out how to get the film out. And then I thought, oh, what am I going to do with this film? It's not like I'd killed someone, but I was so worried about getting rid of the evidence. And it was very stressful for me. But there was something about holding that camera and looking through the lens and focusing it, and it made sense to me. So when I was about 14, I at a garage sale, I found a camera and I thought, this is it. I'm going to spend my money on this camera. And it was a Voigtlander, and it was love at first sight. I loved it. And then I had a Pentax and, my quote unquote real camera. And I started playing with interchangeable lenses, and I was just hooked. And then suddenly I had a dark room, and before you knew it, I was a photographer. I just loved it. There's something about holding that camera in my hand, and it's not the gear, but the making the picture. And when I had a dark room and seeing that picture come to life, like I said, it was just absolutely magical.
It's not about the gear. That's something I'd like to explore with you. You're known as a photographer who doesn't put much emphasis on the technical side of photography. So the camera is more like a tool that you have to master. However, before we move on to topics like vision and creativity, I'd like to briefly touch on the technical side of photography. In your photographic process, what role does it play?
Well, I think you said it very well, Kaya. It's something that you need to master, but it is only a tool. And a tool is, when someone has a tool, the next question is, well, what's the tool for? The priority for me anyway is not on the tool. I don't collect, hammers and saws and spend my time admiring them, though I like them well enough. For me, the excitement is building the thing. In the case of the camera, it is taking those technical skills and using them in service of the creative process and my vision for the photograph. So it's not that I don't put an emphasis on the technical. I think it's very important that we progressively master our craft, because that will enable us to do more with those tools. It will enable us to express our vision and do the creative things we want to do. It's just that they're not the point. The point, to at least to the way that I do photography, is the photographs themselves and the creative process. And so I think it's very important that photographers learn their craft, but as quickly as possible, stop asking, how do I make the quote unquote correct decisions? How do I make the most creative decisions? How do I make the decisions that make photographs that are uniquely my own?
In doing my research for this conversation, I came across a metaphor that you used to describe the relation between the technical and creative side of photography. There you said that mastering photography is like learning a language, the technical aspects being structure, grammar, and words. And the creative side is all about applying these formal rules in a way that produces beautiful and meaningful sentences that then again convey feelings, experiences, and emotion. That's a wonderful way of looking at it. Could you please expand a little bit on that metaphor?
Sure. I love that metaphor, and I think it works for me especially because, right now you and I are speaking, and I'm not thinking ahead and thinking, oh, okay, what words am I going to use? And should I put an adjective in there, or should I use a noun or a verb? And I'm not thinking about any of that. I have, over time, mastered the language to the point where now you and I can speak and we can improvise, and we can be spontaneous, and we can express emotion and all the ideas that we want. And I think when you first get a camera, we long for that kind of ability to improvise, and for it to be, a lot of photographers talk about it being intuitive. But you have to learn that intuition. You have to get to a point where you're so comfortable with your tools, and this is where technique is important, so that you can not set them aside, but so that you're not thinking of them consciously. You're not thinking, oh, what word am I going to use next? You just pick up the camera, and the creative process becomes more, as I said, more intuitive. But it's learning to get there and use the language, to go back to this metaphor, how do you write poetry? Well, there's a lot involved. And while you're reading the poem, you can't imagine that, that the poet was sitting there asking himself all kinds of questions, and being really cerebral about it. It just flows. But the poet had to spend a lot of time well ahead of that learning his craft. So, this to not to blatantly advertise my book, but this is the direction it all headed in, was I know photographers want to be intuitive. They want to be in what Sergio Lorraine, a Chilean photographer, called this state of grace, where everything just flows. But that doesn't come naturally. I don't know any photographer that is just born with that. And so this book was an effort to help photographers ask better questions that would get them more quickly to that quote unquote state of grace, or that intuitive stage where they could pick up their camera and begin focusing more on the creative.
In the subtitle of your book, it says 100 questions for making stronger and more expressive photographs. There it is, the word questions. We as photographers and humans in general often tend to look for the answers and shortcuts and forget that it takes good questions to get to good answers. That strikes me as a very important point. How can we train ourselves to ask better questions that then eventually will lead to better photographs?
Well, I think we already ask questions. It's just that we're not maybe asking the strongest questions. So, for example, every time I do a public presentation and I show my work and I talk about my process, and someone who's probably newer in photography and needs to answer for themselves some of these technical questions, someone will always say, well, what lens did you use? Or what was your aperture? Or what camera did you use? And I've given up on trying to, find creative ways to, I listen and I know what they're actually trying to say, though they don't know it yet. Why did you use the lens that you used? They don't want to know I used a Tamron or a Sigma or a Nikon. They want to know how I made the photograph look the way I did. And if I hear that question as, why did I use that lens? Or as the photographer, while I'm making a picture, ask myself, what do I want to accomplish with the look of this image, and which lens or focal length might do that in the strongest possible way? I don't know. Do you want to compress the elements? Do you want to really isolate things and make them sort of flatter and more graphic? Or do you want to use a wide angle lens because you want that feeling of inclusion? These kind of questions, when you just say, what lens should I use? You're kind of implying that there's only one possible answer. It's this lens or that lens. But creative thinking says, what are all of my possibilities here? What lens could I use? Which focal length could I use? I've got 3 lenses in my bag covering focal lengths from 16 millimeters to 300 millimeters. You would be paralyzed going through all of those focal lengths going, well, is it 35? I don't know. Maybe it's 37. But if you start with, instead of thinking about the correct lens to use, if you start with, what are my possibilities and what do I really want this to feel like? Do I want it to feel super inclusive? Do I want the energy to be really high? Well, if that's the case, it probably is the case that you want to use a wider lens because they do allow exaggerated lines and greater energy, and they allow you to get in close and be part of the action. But again, if the question is simply, well, which aperture should I use? Well, you got a lot of apertures. What do you want it to, do you need some shallow depth of field to create that isolation and to push the background kind of into blur? Or do you need greater depth of field to include certain elements that allow the story to make more sense? Unless you know what you're trying to accomplish, it's almost impossible to answer the question, what should I do? But the moment we say, what can I do? What are the possibilities? What do I want this photograph to feel like? Suddenly, there are immense possibilities. And that's where creative thinking, that's where the things get exciting for me, because then again, it's not just the same photograph everyone else has made. It's the one that you decide. And it's not just the lens and the aperture and the shutter, but it's the combination of these things and where your point of view is. Do you go high? Do you go low? Do you move over to the side? All of these things work together. And I think the better we are at asking the questions, again, not to find one specific answer, but just to see the possibilities, I think the stronger our photographs become.
And not get overwhelmed with all the options one has at one's disposal. I think that's also the point of asking good questions, to narrow all the options down to a point where you know exactly what you want and don't become paralyzed, right?
Yeah, I think so. And it is easy to become paralyzed. And I think that's where it just comes down to, let's see. Which one could I use? Let's see. Make the photograph, find out, see how it feels. And then if that doesn't work, just react to it and try something completely different. We're not saving lives here. This is not, we're not looking for a cure for cancer. There's no cost involved with making a mistake. Especially if that mistake then leads us to a better expression of what we're trying to do. Okay, it's not an 80 millimeter lens. It's not a 200. Maybe I should try the 16.
There are many intriguing questions that you raise in your book, and one of them we just touched on is how do you evoke emotion with your images? How do you create emotion-fueled photographs that really get under your skin? And you say there are enough images in the world that show us what things look like, but they don't show us what it feels like. And I think that's exactly what many photographers struggle with. They might be able to create technically perfect images that are well exposed and follow the basic rules of composition. But still, they don't grab you. They don't convey to the viewer what the photographer felt like being in that particular situation when he pressed the shutter button. How does one achieve that? Or in other words, how do you transmit emotion in an image?
Well, I think, Kai, one of the things that as photographers we do is when we first start out, we study cameras and we study lenses and we study the settings. But one of the things that photographers don't do enough, in my experience, is study actual photographs. It would be like wanting to be a musician and never really listening to a lot of music and understanding, why does this piece of music make me feel the way I feel? Why does it tell the story that it does? And photographers need to study photographs. And if you're trying to accomplish a certain feeling, look at photographs that make you feel in those ways and reverse engineer them, pull them apart and say, why do I feel this way? Why am I reading the photograph the way I'm reading it? What decisions did the photographer make? Is it instead of shooting it, with the sun over my shoulder, I moved my position so that instead the light was to the side or backlit? Is it the color temperature? Am I not being bold enough in my choices in either in camera or in post-production with color temperature, or allowing maybe some lens flare into your photograph? Or, there's energy can be such a big part of our photographs, but too often we kind of ignore the fact that, that longer lens might be deadening. It might be taking away the energy from the scene. And maybe we need a wider lens. Maybe you need to focus more on the colors. Maybe your colors just aren't working very well together. There's so many different ways that we can make a photograph feel a certain way. And rather than unpack all of that, I think the photographer needs to say, what photographs make me feel this way, and what, because it's right there, Kai. It's right in the photograph. It's not like there's some secret thing behind the photograph. There's no secret code or anything. You can look at the image that makes you feel a certain way and go, what is it? Is it, on my desktop right now, I have a photograph of a rhinoceros, but it's just a silhouette of rhinoceros. It's backlit and the sun is shining not on the grass, but through the grass. And so it's warm and it's bright, and it feels so much different because it's backlit and underexposed relative to what the camera wanted. If I had photographed this the way the camera wanted, it would be overexposed. It would be kind of gross. I'd see all the details in the rhinoceros, but I just wouldn't care. Right now, I can see no details in this rhinoceros. It's just a silhouette. But there's so much more impact. There's a little bit of rim light around his body. And because I'm not thinking about the details, I'm looking at the shape of the horn and the backlight coming through the grass. These are things that we make choices about. You don't show up at a scene all the time and just go, oh, look, it's backlit. Backlight isn't a kind of light. Backlight is a phenomenon that exists only relative to our position to the light. You can make backlight. You want a backlight? Just walk so that you're facing your subject is between you and the sun, and it will be illuminated from the back, and that's a choice that you can make to add emotion or mood to your photograph. There's mystery is part of emotion and mood. We're so hung up on the idea of making sure we get all the details in the shadows. But if you are photographing a scene with quite a high contrast light, and you if you expose for the brightest highlights, then the darkest parts you're going to lose detail there. but you're going to get some fantastic shadows. Shadows give mood and they create mystery. They create places for all those details that aren't important to hide. They create great compositional elements. And so techniques like this and the ability just to recognize when they might be used to express what you want to express can bring emotion and mood into a photograph, and energy that we might not otherwise have. But the camera's not going to do it for us. We have to be the ones to go, this is my opportunity to respond to this light, to move my position, to use a different kind of lens, to maybe choose a stronger moment. Those are all our choices.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not about technical perfection, quite to the contrary. Blur, for example, can add to a particular mood of an image. And earlier on, you mentioned the Chilean photographer Sergio Larraín, who also happened to be one of my favorite photographers. When you look at his images, for example, you notice that so often the focus is off, there's grain, they are blurry, but yet they are so dense and full of life and emotion. You don't get all that by only focusing on technical perfection.
Oh, everyone wants images that are tack sharp. And I think we've become so obsessed with it that we're getting images that are more perfect, but less poetic. And I very often shoot at 1/15th of a second, 1/8 of a second, trying my hardest to get that blur, the hand moving, or, because that's one of the ways that we feel something about the photograph. Yes, we know someone is moving. You can freeze the action, and sometimes that's exactly what you need. But also very often, it's not the right tool. Very often, to show that motion, you've got to blur some stuff. You can keep the camera still and just have that subject blur, or you can move the camera. You can pan with them. And I mean, I'd much rather see, if I'm going to look at a picture of a race car, I'd much rather see a picture not where it's frozen in time, but where the camera has moved and panned and created this sense of, oh my God, look how fast that car is moving. I can feel it. We are primarily emotional beings. Our reactions to photographs are primarily emotional. They are not this sort of rational. It's only the photographers that are looking at the images and going, now, I don't know, is that tack sharp? I mean, do I see a little chromatic aberration there? I mean, we're so hung up on it that it might be preventing us from actually recognizing the opportunity for the poetic rather than the perfect.
You said discovering all the tools that are out there, it helps to look at good photographs and to reverse engineer the photographs, try to find out what is it that speaks to you. Do you recommend looking at pictures on social media, for example, on Instagram, find photographers that you like, or more to put more focus on famous photographers and looking at books? What would you recommend?
I would recommend all of those things, but with the caveat that when we are on social media, we are generally not studying things. We have been trained to look and to scroll and to move on, and we often are not just looking at one image, we're looking at 30 or 40, and so it's very quickly forgettable. So I think Instagram is a great place to discover new photography. And let's be honest, some of the famous photographers just aren't going to resonate with you. And some people that you have never heard of are going to create work that takes your breath away. So I don't have a lot of regard for whether someone has a name or doesn't. I think find photographers. What's important is that the photographers that you study have a certain diversity to them. It can't all be the same thing that you're already making, so that you can look at the photograph and say, see, I'm doing okay. My stuff is, you need to be looking at stuff made from different photographers from different places. I live in Canada, but in this part of the world, the focus is very often on North American, or very specifically American photographers. And there are Japanese photographers that have so much to teach us. There are African photographers and Australian photographers and European photographers. And, and with every sort of divergence. If I look at a Japanese photographer, they're going to be showing me work that might be very different from what is accepted as quote unquote good photography in North America. And I need to expose myself to that. But I prefer, if I'm going to study photographs, I prefer to buy a book and invest the time and the money and put it on my coffee table and look at one image at a time and really study it. Not just looking at photographs doesn't help us. Studying them, really soaking it in and saying, what do I love about this? What does this image feel like to me? And how could I maybe use that in my own photography? Not how can I copy it, but, for example, I learned a lot from Sebastião Salgado. I looked at his work and his use of wide angle lens and backlight. And there's a lot of, I never ever tried to consciously copy Sebastião Salgado. But I have often thought, you know what? There is something in this photograph that I don't see in my own photograph. How can I learn that tool or that device or that technique and incorporate it into my own style of photography? And I think that is so valuable. All of these magazines that we buy, they're half full of advertisements and they all promise the latest lens to unlock your creativity and whatever nonsense they're trying to use to sell their stuff. One of the best things that you can do is just spend the money instead on books of photography, learn the history of the craft, learn what others have done before you, what they've done well and what maybe, is overdone, and learn what you love. You would do that if you were learning to be a chef. You wouldn't disregard the history of cooking. You wouldn't not try recipes from other people and see what you like and what you don't, and then innovate from that. You would learn that as part of it. You would learn the fundamentals. You wouldn't just keep buying newer and sharper knives.
Great. Yeah, exactly. It's, like you said, it's studying the photographs, not copying a particular style, but to find out the tools that the photographers used and take the tools that resonate with you and stack them up in your own toolbox and then apply them in a different way and give it your own vision, and then out of that you create something new and you're not just copying someone else's work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you just said stack them up in your toolbox, and I think that's a really good way of looking at it. I think it's one thing to learn how to use backlight the way that you like to use it. It's another thing to learn how to use your aperture and a slower shutter to capture some motion or to play with perspective, and change in your point of view or your POV. But to do those things together and combine them in new ways, and to incorporate that into your composition and your storytelling, when you combine them, when you, as you said, stack them, it's the layers that stacking creates that can be all your own. You're not going to discover a new aperture. There's no new apertures out there. The shutter speeds, you're not going to be like, oh, he's the guy that invented, f 17.6. Oh yeah, I remember that guy. No, the tools are, you're not going to discover anything new, but the combinations and how you use them, I love that way of putting it, stack them, is really, I think that's where innovation will come. That's where you will find your own voice.
Yeah, or going back to the metaphor of photography being a language, like we all use the same words, but we don't use them in the same order, and we all put them together differently, and out of that, that's where the poetry and the beauty comes from.
Absolutely, and some of the best poetry isn't correct. I mean, there's an American poet called E.E. Cummings, and his poetry is not. I mean, my English teacher from grade 7 would have a seizure if I wrote like that. I mean, I had to learn the more conventional ways of being understood with this language. But eventually, if I want to write the kind of poetry that E.E. Cummings did, I need to stop thinking in terms of the rules and how should I use my nouns and my verbs, and I need to start thinking, how can I use these, and also use rhythm in ways that maybe I was never taught. again, it's these stacking, these layers that can create something that's much more powerful than the latest technique you're going to learn in the magazines.
And taking the time to really dive deep into a picture, like with the social media nowadays, it's also fleeting. You just rush through your Instagram feed and give a like here and there, but then stop when you discover that you hit a like or gave a like to a photo, and then ask yourself the question, why did I do that? Because very often it's out of an impulse. You see something and you're not really aware of why you liked the photo, but then I think that's when you have to go back and ask yourself these questions, and then you get the answers that really will help you to develop your own photography.
I think so. I think, social media exists for different people for different reasons. And some people, I will click like on a photograph, not because I'm saying, hey, I really like this photograph necessarily. It might actually be a pretty crap photograph of someone just doing something, but I'm saying, I want you to know I saw this and I was thinking about you. It doesn't, so when we look at our likes, I mean, this is why social media can be so damaging, is you look at your own likes and you think, well, shoot, I only got 50 likes. And you look at someone else who's, got 1 million followers, and you're like, and they got like 300,000 likes on that crappy photograph. Well, those likes were not necessarily saying this is a good photograph. We don't know what they're saying. And so when we allow our experience of social media to be the gauge of our own talent or the reception or relevance of our work, we're using numbers to signify something when they're actually completely meaningless, or maybe they're not meaningless, but we don't have the tools to decipher them, and on top of that, there's the algorithm. It may be that only 50 people saw that photograph. And then 50 people liked it. Hey, that's 100%. I mean, you're doing it, but you would never know that because we don't get to know that information. And so I think social media is actually very hostile to creativity. I think it creates too much, it discourages different points of view. It discourages creativity, and really it just kind of rewards people for clicking buttons and scrolling kind of mindlessly. So I use social media. I'm not down on social media. I think it's just a tool, and we need to ask ourselves, as we do with every tool, how can I best use this tool? We don't just, get a new hammer and hammer everything. There's a place and a time for hammering. It's when you got to pound a nail in. Otherwise, there's other tools for things, and social media, I don't think, is the best tool for actually studying thoughtfully and slowly the craft that we all love so much.
Looking at someone else's images is one thing, looking at your own another. I think that going through your archive from time to time can be hugely beneficial. Do you think that the same strategies and tactics apply evaluating your own work and looking at your own images than looking at someone else's?
I do, actually. I think that once you learn what you love about this craft and what you're trying to accomplish, you can look at any photograph and ask yourself, how does this make me feel? What was the artist trying to accomplish? How did they do that? The difficulty and the benefit, it's a two-sided coin, is that when it's our own photograph, we sometimes read it in a way that other people won't, because we bring all of what we were trying to accomplish, but maybe didn't quite get, but we were really trying and we worked really hard on it. And so the image means more to us than what it actually is as a two-dimensional graphic, presentation. But we can also look at an image that we've made and understand what we were trying to accomplish in a way that we wouldn't with another person's work. I think that when it comes to our own work, the thing that is most difficult is accepting that it is ours, and instead of saying, well, is it good? I should maybe get 100 people to look at it and tell me if it's good, because I don't know if it's good. That's one of the points of this book, The Heart of the Photograph, is that there's no such thing on a certain level. There's no such thing as a good photograph. What does that even mean? There is no objective standard. Is it sharp? Is it in focus? Is it quote unquote well exposed? Well, even those, I'm not sure what all of those necessarily have to do with my emotional response to a photograph or my ability to express something through a photograph. There are many photographs through history that are iconic, that were instrumental in social change and, are genuinely art. And they're not necessarily sharp. They're not necessarily perfectly exposed. My God, some of the highlights might be blown out. I mean, if you took some of these photographs from history and you scanned them into Photoshop and looked at the histogram, you'd be like, oh my God, what was he thinking? There's no detail in the shadows. There's no detail in the highlights. I can't respect this guy anymore. When it comes to looking at your own images and recognizing your own voice, I think the question is not, is this good? The question is it really truly mine? And am I evolving in my ability to make these kinds of images? Because if you're looking at it right now and your biggest hope is that this is the best photograph ever, you know what? In a year from now, you're going to look at it and go, it was all right. But I've learned so much since then. I've become a different person. I'm trying to express things, in stronger ways. So that image, really, the big question for me is it mine? I don't care if other people like it. Do I look at it and go, yes, that does what I was trying to do? And then can I learn from it? Is there something I would change? Is there something that maybe I'm a little sloppy here? Maybe I cut off the bottom of the guy's foot at the bottom of the frame. Maybe I need to pay a little more attention to, the question is, how can we be okay with what we make instead of always asking, the internet, do you like it? I mean, stop asking the friggin' internet whether they like your photograph, because you ask 100 people and 50 are going to say they love it. 50 are going to say they don't care. And then 30 people you didn't even ask are going to chime in with other opinions. And you're going to be left not only not having an answer to your question, but you're going to be left doubting your own voice and going, I don't know, maybe they're right. Maybe it is crap. I can put out a photograph that I love and people go, doesn't do anything for me. You know what? That's fine. You're not my audience. If you don't love the book that I just put out, that's okay. Maybe there's something in your feedback that I can learn and use for the next book, but I can't exactly rewrite it. It's out. But I can recognize that, okay, this book just wasn't for you. You were not the audience for this book. And it's the same thing with our photographs and anything that we do that's creative. The fact is, the whole world isn't going to love it. And if they do, there's probably something wrong with it. If everyone loves it, it's probably just safe and homogenous and boring. I'm okay with the fact that not everyone's going to like it. And again, this is one of the problems with social media is we think the good photographs, the best stuff we can create, is the stuff that's going to get the most amount of likes. And that is not only untrue, but I think that expectation is damaging to us as photographers, because then we're trying to create what everyone else wants. Figure out what you want. And yes, also find some people that, like 1, 2, 3 people that you respect, that understand what you're trying to accomplish, that have done this for longer than you, and let them show your stuff to them and say, what do you think? And hopefully they will be asking questions like, well, tell me what you were trying to accomplish, rather than just looking at it going, well, if I had done this. Well, you didn't. It's not your photograph. It's my photograph. And I'm asking you to help me understand where my craft and my vision collide. And is there something you see here that maybe I could be doing in stronger ways? Maybe you have an idea for incorporating, maybe you look at it and go, I love your composition. I love your storytelling, but it's a little static. Have you thought about playing for a year with a slower shutter speed and getting some motion in there? Have you thought about abandoning that 85 millimeter lens that you're so fond of because it's safe and working with a 24 millimeter lens for a year and really getting comfortable with a different way of using space and composition and the way that, a 24 millimeter lens, if you want to use it well, you got to get close. And a lot of us are scared. And that's why we like our 70 to 200, because we can stand kind of a little further back, but you can feel that distance in the photographs that are made with that kind of lens. So we do need people that can look at our work critically, but you cannot let those people self-select. You cannot let them say, oh, I'll give you feedback, because you know what? They just want to hear themselves talk. You've got to choose them, because only you know where you're trying to go with your work. If I wanted to create, if I was a painter and I wanted to create really realistic, kind of paintings, I probably would not be going to Picasso and saying, help me out here. Because he would probably be wanting to push me in another direction. That doesn't mean I wouldn't listen to him. I just probably wouldn't seek him out, because I would probably have more in common with a National Geographic photographer and, go to one of my friends who shoots for National Geographic and say, I've just shot a project. Tell me which work here you think is the strongest. And then let's talk about why. That would be helpful. And not everyone has friends in National Geographic. I don't necessarily mean that, but there are lots of people that have been doing this for a little longer than you have that you can sit down with and say, tell me what you think is the strongest. Tell me what you think is maybe not resonating with you, and just maybe I'm fooling myself, but let's talk about why. If you don't have the conversation about why, it's useless information.
I love the question that what did you have in mind when you took the photograph, or what did you want to convey with the image? I think that's a very good approach to also for you as a photographer, you get the answers of how you could have made it even stronger. Or I think that's a very, very good approach if you can find another one critiquing your work with that question in mind. That's great.
And I think, absolutely. And I think you also need to be asking that question when you make the photograph. I think if you were looking at one of my photographs, Kai, and said, so tell me what you had in mind here. Tell me what you were trying to accomplish. And I said, actually, I have no idea. Well, no wonder it didn't turn out very well. I mean, how would I make a choice about where I stood or put the camera? How would I make a choice about the type of the focal length I used, or my aperture, or my shutter speed? How would I make any compositional or storytelling? The only thing I could do is just point and shoot. Right. And then you wonder why it didn't turn out. It's like looking at a poem or a painting and saying, well, what were you trying to accomplish? I don't know. I just, I just put words down. The words just kept coming out, and okay. But maybe there's a hint in that response as to why it doesn't make any sense, as to why it's not particularly emotional, because you made no choices. And ultimately, this whole book is just my, imperfect attempt at getting photographers to answer that one question. What are you trying to accomplish? And then how, using the tools that you've already learned, how can you use all of that in the most creative way to accomplish that thing? And hopefully, as you grow as a photographer, I've been doing this for 35 years, almost 30, anyway, over 30 years. And I feel like I'm only now beginning to really get it. I feel like now I'm kind of like, all right, now those layers in my visual toolbox, that stack has really gelled, and I'm comfortable going, no, you know what? This isn't part of right now, this isn't part of like, I don't do strobe photography. You're not going to look through my images and go, wow, he's really good with flash. It's just not what I do. It's not what I've learned it and I understand it, and it taught me a lot about light. But at a certain point I went, no, it's just not for me. It's mostly, if I could just have, my Fuji or my Leica with a 24 millimeter-ish lens, I'd be happy. And if you told me I could only photograph in black and white, much as I loved color, I'd be like, all right, I can do that. And some people would be like, no way, I can't do anything unless it's a full color 300 millimeter lens, medium. Great. That's your choice. But after 30 years now, I'm finally comfortable with it and going, okay, you know what? Now it's getting to that Sergio Lorraine state of grace where it is finally, after so long, becoming a little bit more intuitive, Its craft is a very long game.
It's a long game, and often finding your own photographic voice, finding your vision, your own unique style, developing it, is compared to a journey. A journey has many, many stops along the way. You can look back on a more than 30-year-long career. What are the milestones along the way for you that you can identify that have raised your craft to the next level?
Yeah, that's a great question. For a long time, I didn't know what I wanted. I was learning to use tools, but I didn't know what I wanted to use those tools for. And it was only when I had been a photographer for maybe 15 years. I don't mean professionally. I just mean since I really started learning to make photographs. It was 15 years before I went to Haiti. And I remember putting my camera to my face and maybe making a couple dozen images and going, this is what I want to do with my photography. I've spent 15 years learning my tools to this point. Now I understand what I want to do. I wanted to tell stories. I wanted to be a humanitarian photographer, and I wanted to photograph cultures that were different than my own and places that were different than my own. And so that was a huge awakening to me. That was the sudden realization of, okay, right now I know I've learned some of my craft, but it has been incomplete because I haven't had any kind of vision for it. I've just been picking up my camera and kind of playing with settings and hope something, I was just trying to make images that didn't suck. I was just trying to make some images that just were not that sucky. And then one day I woke up in Haiti and went, no, there's something more. That was one of those big realizations. Another was when I really started to learn how to tell stories and understand the visual language, that it wasn't just about using the tools to do this thing, to make these photographs, but actually that our tools are not necessarily just our camera and our lens or shutter speed, but that they are things like balance and tension, that they're things like color harmony and storytelling. I mean, so many photographers say, oh, I'm a visual storyteller. And you say, great, tell me about story. Tell me why this photograph has story. What makes it a story? And what makes it a compelling story? And they'll look at you like you just licked their sensor. I mean, they just have no idea what it actually means to tell a story. And if you want to tell stories, you have to understand the basic elements of story, and you have to understand conflict and contrast and point of view and the role of point of view in a photograph to bring the viewer into it as one of the characters. You have to understand character and setting and how they relate and relationship of elements and all of this stuff that I had no clue about for years. And I woke up and went, you know what? This is just like the example I used earlier on with you. I've been learning to play a guitar, but I have no idea how to make a great song. I don't know anything about it. I just know the guitar, and I know certain key chords go well together, and I know how to tune it. And it sure is clean. But, I didn't know much more than that. And I woke up to this realization that, like everyone will at some point, that our craft is a journey. And I had not arrived on this journey. I had only taken, the natural progression of steps, and there was so much more for me to learn. And so, my encouragement to those that are listening is, a lot of the things I just said, like in the last 3 minutes, you're probably going, what the hell is he talking about? Maybe that information just isn't, you're just not ready for it. But at a certain point, you're going to want more. You will master sharpness and exposing for different kinds of light, and your compositions will be, you'll move on past the rule of thirds, and then you'll go, okay, what am I trying to do here? And to your delight, you will find out that there are so many more new things to learn. This isn't about, you get to a place of, being a master photographer. You just will progressively, I hope, keep learning these things, because when you get to that point, and I keep coming back to this idea of this state of grace where it's intuitive, you're serving something bigger. It's not about the camera. Someone could put any camera in my hand at this point, and I'm finally, after 30 years, at a point where I'm like, I don't even care what it is. I will make the photograph that I want with this thing. It could be a crappy old Konica 35 millimeter. It could be anything, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether it's got 100 buttons or 3. If you know how to use your shutter, your aperture, and focus it, the rest is all in your head. It's not on the camera body.
Yeah. And, the intuition, that's, I think it's key that, at one point you get to that point where intuition takes over and you are not there in the moment of taking the photograph, making all the decisions and running through all the questions, that you might have. And then the moment is gone. But, once you achieve that state that, intuition takes over in the decisive moments, then, I think you've come a long way as a photographer.
You have. But the nice thing is there will always be areas where that intuition is not yet well trained, so there will always be some new thing to learn in some way. I think the danger of the book that I wrote here is that someone might pick it up and look at it and go, 100 questions. I haven't got time for 100 questions. And then they'll open the damn thing and they'll find out there's way more than 100 questions in here. How can I make a photograph? I mean, the light will be gone. The moment will be over. I'll be an old man before I answer all of these questions. These are not necessarily the questions you ask altogether in the moment. They're the questions we learn to ask and train that intuition so that when the moment presents itself, maybe you've learned to anticipate that moment. Maybe you've already taken a look at the light and asked yourself some questions so that, when you walk into that particular building, you're not seeing a great moment and going, oh my gosh, my ISO, I got to put my ISO up. But you've walked into that building and just reached down and turned your ISO up because I can't make a photograph in this building at ISO 100. And you've done it in anticipation of. And so this is not a conversation about, you ask all these questions and finally you get there and your intuition has been trained and here I go. And worse, until then, I'm a lesser photographer. No, we're all learning along the way. And for some people that realize it's just enough that you finally figure out exposure. It's just enough that you get to that point where one day you're like, yes, I finally understand how to use my histogram to expose and not blow out my highlights. And your images will get so much better. But the beautiful thing is then you will have a new thing to learn. Then it will be wide angle lenses and then it will be slower shutters. And then it could be more creative things like multiple exposure and intentional camera movement. And we will always have some new exciting thing to learn. And I think that's one of the things I love about photography is I have never once woken up and thought, well, that's it. I've got to the end. I know it all. I wake up and I go, man, there's just so much more I could do here. And that's exciting.
It keeps us moving forward. David, you're a prolific writer. You have written so many books. How many are there exactly up to this point?
Well, if you include my ebooks and the 2 that will come out next month, I am at 32.
32 books.
I don't know how that happened. I thought I was going to be a photographer and suddenly I'm a writer.
Yeah. What was the motivation behind writing this particular book, your last book that we've been talking about?
It's just, I think it's the culmination of my own understanding of how I am a photographer, but I'm also a teacher. And I have been learning not just my own craft as a photographer, but as a teacher. And I have finally, I think, got to a point where I could talk about these things in a way that it has only until now been internal. I ask myself a lot of questions. I think questions are really important for the creative process, not in an effort to find the answer, but in an effort to uncover possibilities. And it was the book that I wish that I had 15 years ago when I did finally realize there was something more than just learning the tools that I wanted to do it, because there's nothing in here. I mean, it's, if you want to learn how to use a histogram, or understand hyperfocal distances, or, there's nothing in this book for you. It's not that kind of book. But I sure could have used it 15 years ago when I realized, okay, I'm starting to kind of get the tools. I'm starting to feel comfortable with them. Now what's that next step? How can I think more creatively? How can I think not in terms of, is it a good photograph, but is it the photograph I want to make? And I never had a book that gave me that kind of freedom or helped direct my understanding in that kind of way. And so they all always say, write the book that you want to exist or needed or wished you had. And this is that book for me. Along with others, along with Soul of the Camera. I think Soul of the Camera and The Heart of the Photograph, they were kind of intended to go together.
Great books. I can highly recommend reading them. I read them myself, and they've been a huge inspiration or source of inspiration for me on my journey in photography and towards greater creativity. And what I like about them is that the focus is on the why and not so much on the how.
Thank you.
David, I want to be respectful with your time. It's been a huge pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
So one last thing before we wrap up. What's the best place on the internet for people to connect with you?
The best place is just to go to my website, to davidduchemin.com. You can also find me at craftandvision.com. But you'll find all of that if you just go to davidduchemin.com. You'll find links to my books and to my new podcast and all of that sort of thing.
You mentioned your new podcast, A Beautiful Anarchy. It's also on my playlist. I love listening to it. It's great, very short, right to the point, 15-minute long episodes about all the things that creatives are struggling with, but also about the joys of leading a creative life.
Thank you.
And one last thing I'd like to point our listeners to is your newsletter. We often sign up for newsletters, and then when they get into our mailbox, we don't really pay attention to them. With yours, it's different. I always look forward to receiving it. Your mails are carefully and thoughtfully crafted, always a great source of inspiration. So a newsletter very much worthwhile signing up for. David, thank you very much for all the work you put out there, and it's been a huge honor having you on my podcast. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you, Kai.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Ja, das war das Interview mit David duChemin, Autor und Fotograf aus Kanada. Mal wieder eine Episode auf Englisch. Ich hoffe, du hast alles verstanden. Ich denke, das ist eine gute Möglichkeit, um auch internationale Gäste in den Podcast zu bringen und die Themenbandbreite dadurch deutlich zu erhöhen. Schreib mir gerne mal, was du davon hältst und ob du dieses Format gerne öfter haben möchtest. Mir hat es auf jeden Fall unheimlich viel Freude gemacht, mich mit David zu unterhalten. Seine Bücher stehen schon lange in meinem Regal. Vielen Dank fürs Zuhören und bis zum nächsten Mal. Dein Kai.